Simmons, Slauson, Tepper,
Here.
Villalobos, Wally, Wu.
All right, quorum is present. Thank you, members, for getting back with us promptly. The chair calls Commissioner Morath, and we will continue. The chair recognizes Representative Collier. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Just to pick up, Commissioner Morath, I want to follow up on the questions that we'll pick up where we left off. And so the question surrounded private school, because we talked about the $1 billion that is a contingency allocation. And you were telling me about oversight of certified teachers within the private school system. And you said that they would be subjected to comply with the Texas Education Code. Is that right?
Specifically, if a certified educator engages in activity that violates that engages in certain prohibited activity, this is typically like sexual misconduct with a child, then that educator, if they're certified in private school, the private school is required to report that to us, and that ends up resulting in, with due process, that educator being placed on the Do Not Hire registry.
So this department that is mentioned in your presentation about handling misconduct and complaints, would they accept complaints filed against a certified teacher within a private school on matters that are not related to sexual misconduct?
That is a good question. I don't actually know the answer off the top of my head. I think the answer is yes, because there's a code of conduct, basically a certified educator code of conduct, and this is regulated by a body called SBEC that we are their staff. It's the State Board for Educator Certification. And SBEC is empowered to take action against the certification of any certified educator, whether the nature of the action happens in a school or outside of a school. So if there's some sort of activity that warrants a certification sanction, I think that SBEC is empowered to do that even if the person doesn't currently work in public education.
So again, under this department that's mentioned in your presentation, I went back and looked at HB 3 from the previous sessions where we, updated the code, and it said that a requirement to report employee misconduct. This is saying it's in the family code because you mentioned that earlier. Private schools are not. Are they required to report employee misconduct?
I think the answer is yes for the specific issues that can result in an educator being placed on a Do Not Hire registry, which is it's sexual misconduct with a child, but it's also like slightly broader, sort of abuse of children.
Okay, and then do you know how many certified teachers are at the private schools here in Texas?
I don't think we have that information. We certainly know how many certified educators there are in Texas, but if they're not currently employed in public education, I don't know that we capture their current employment status independent of public education.
And in private schools, currently and under the proposal under SB, I think it is 2, they are not required to employ certified teachers. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So if there's a certified teacher that a parent or somebody, that has a stake in what goes on is concerned about, who would they report that conduct to?
If it's a certified educator, they can report it to us, and we're the administrative arm for the State Board of Educator Certification. Sort of like you have a complaint against a nurse, it goes to the nursing board. And so that's who they would complain to if it is a certified educator. But if it's not a certified educator, then it may or may not be in our jurisdiction. And it's just as one point of clarification, School districts are also not required to employ certified educators in most circumstances either. That's its
Is that
own-
all traditional public schools?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why you saw on this chart a huge growth in the number of uncertified teachers in the state of Texas in public schools.
But
So-
are they supposed to be in a program to become certified?
There's a provision called District of Innovation that allows a district to completely opt out of the certification requirements, and most districts have now used that provision and opted out of the certification requirements.
But is that something you have to approve at the commission, or
No.
they could just file paperwork and say we opt out of having certified teachers?
Yeah, the paperwork requirements are slightly more robust than that, but it doesn't involve agency approval at all. It's a local school board decision.
So these districts of, since you brought it up, these districts of innovation, are they certain types of schools? Like they're not just a traditional public school, they're created with a lot of input, and are they sometimes with community colleges or?
So the District of Innovation is a process that any ISD can go through, and when they go through it, what they are essentially doing is they are deregulating themselves out of certain aspects of the education code.
But it's not like I just fill out the paperwork and tomorrow I can become one.
That's right. There's something called a district advisory committee that has to opine on this, and then it has to be approved by a majority vote of the school board at a public meeting, and there's like a 30-day posting requirement. There's some steps that you have to go through.
So it's not overnight where I become a district of innovation.
That's correct.
And there is some type of, like you said, the school board has to approve it.
Yeah,
Do the TEA has no input on it?
that's correct.
Okay, so they can just decide locally.
That's right.
All right. So then let me move on to my next question that dealt with charter schools. I think that there was a question about the charter schools, and you mentioned about the A through F rating being suspended or, during the pendency of the lawsuit. So currently, charter schools, I think Rep. Berry talked about expanding charter schools, and if it's an A or B rating, I think you said it would automatic.
Yeah.
So what's going on now since the suspension? Have charters been able to expand?
That's a great question. We have had to adopt sort of emergency rules to consider what to do with charters over the last 2 years, given that the courts have enjoined us on A through F. So we normally just rely on A through F ratings. We have authority to rely on other performance indicators, and so we've adopted a kind of a temporary rulemaking framework to look at other performance indicators to decide how to approve charter expansions while we're waiting for A through F to be returned to existence.
So have any charters been expanded under this new rule?
Undoubtedly, because we get expansion requests every year, and we've been enjoined for 2 years. I can get you the specifics on, I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but...
Will you provide a list of the standards that you're looking at, the performance measures
Yes.
you said that are being considered to expand charters, and provide that to us, please? I would greatly appreciate it. And then also, has the suspension of the A through F rating impacted our traditional public schools in any way in terms of their funding? Like, are there other standards that are based on the ratings that would contribute to a school's funding?
No, your A through F rating doesn't affect school district finance, I think, in any way.
Okay. And then the other topic that I want to focus on deals with the property reappraisals, because it is my understanding that the comptroller will issue an estimate of the property values, and that estimate is used by school, I guess it's compared, school districts when they actually collect, and if it's not within 10% or something of the collection, then they could be subject to a financial penalty. Is that right?
Yeah, you're talking about the issue of whether or not we use state values or local values in determining the entitlement of the district. And so there's a variety of circumstances where a CAD, an appraisal district, will fall out of allowed tolerance under law with the state comptroller's appraisal study. And when that happens, it has a substantive impact on the district's budget, because sort of the way the law is written, we interpret that in a manner analogous to the local school board, just cut everybody's tax rates. And if a school board decides to go below the tier 1 tax rate, what's referred to as the maximum compressed rate, if a school board willingly lowers taxes, which they're allowed to do, we reduce their entitlement proportionally. And so when a district is on state values, effectively what that means is, at least from the comptroller's perspective, the property appraisals in that jurisdiction are materially lower than they should have been, and it's sort of a property tax cut given another way. And as a result, the school district does not receive its full entitlement under the Foundation School Program.
So you use the word willingly. If the appraisal district is the one that made the decision to do reappraisals at a different time frame or different interval, how is it that the school district is willingly changing?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think you're probably speaking about like Tarrant County.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I represent Tarrant County.
Yeah, so it is that is the rub, because many school districts don't think this is happening willingly. And this is where I think it's a subject of some policymaking, should be subject of some policymaking attention by this body. It's not strictly speaking appropriations. School districts control board seats on appraisal districts. The way that board seats get appointed on appraisal districts, and so whoever controls the board of an appraisal district controls the appraisal district. The school district gets, all the school districts in a given county get proportionate votes, but other taxing entities also get proportionate votes. And then in the big districts, you now have these 2 public members, I think, that are elected. So there are, I think, situations where if you thought of all of the school districts in a given county in the aggregate, they may actually have sufficient voting control that their appointees, their elected representatives on the appraisal district board actually have a controlling interest.
So wait. So you're saying that each school district gets one person on the appraisal?
It's much more complicated than that, but conceptually, yes.
Okay.
In reality, no.
Okay.
So there are circumstances where the school districts in the aggregate could actually have controlling vote, and then there are situations where school districts in the aggregate do not have the controlling vote. But
you're talking hypothetically, though.
Yeah, and so it is. So school districts do, in fact, have some oversight over how appraisal districts run, but they have to use that oversight to deal with these issues when they come up.
Okay, so then in reality, they have input because they provide input just like I would as a person in the public, and they don't have the vote actually to cast, because it's more of a...
The representatives of the school boards, the representatives of the school board on the CAD appraisal board are in fact the control, they're among many others. But I mean, let's just, for the sake of argument, let's assume it's a 9-member body.
Right.
And the school boards as a whole in that county happen to be able to control 4 of those 9 members. They can nominate and then get 4 of the slots. Well, that means they don't have majority control over that board, but they've got a pretty significant voting influence. So school districts can use that influence to influence appraisal policy. But this is the reason why I think this is worthy of y'all's policymaking attention, because if school boards are essentially held accountable under the school finance system for effective tax appraisals, and they don't actually have the full control to ensure that effective tax appraisals are happening, you may want to do something about that, because then a school district will be in a situation where their budget is cut and they don't really have an effective remedy, which I think is the case in Tarrant County.
Yeah, I think it's like $100 million between
In
6
the aggregate,
schools. Yeah. Between 6 schools, so that's a problem for us. So then, in terms of the appraisals, with the reappraisals, is there a process in place that allows them to seek a waiver of the what is it called? You don't
State
get the
values,
full amount.
low cost.
And you don't get the full funding, or what?
So there's the way that the state values determination works is if you are out of the state values band by between 5 and 10%, you get 2 full years of grace where it doesn't affect you operationally in any way. But your third year, if you're still between 5 and 10% out of bands, that's when we are required under law to switch, and we use the comptroller's values rather than your local values, and that's when districts will see a significant cut in their budget. However, if you are out of bands by more than 10%, there is no grace, it's immediate. And often school districts discover this happens after it's too late for them to have done anything, even if they did have a controlling interest in the appraisal district. So some mechanism to ensure the appraisal process is happening well is also probably needs to be coupled with some sort of temporary grant for school districts that are in this circumstance, where it sort of happened and they didn't know it was happening and it was too late for them to do anything about it.
So you don't have authority right now to
No.
to authorize anything that would give them a waiver or exemption?
No, this does require statutory action by the legislature.
Okay. And so if they're not reappraising on a regular basis and it's out of line, then they could be penalized.
Yeah, their budgets will go down if they fall outside of the state comptroller's value study. Now, they may make all these changes and not fall outside of the values determination that the comptroller makes. And if that's the case, then no muss, no fuss. But if they do, as you stated, I think the CFOs in the Tarrant County area have done some calculations, and they've projected something like $100 million per year reduction in funding. It may or may not prove to be that, because it kind of depends on how all this plays out, but that's certainly in the realm of possibility.
Okay, and then my office will circle back with you because I want to clarify and clear up some of the conversation about whether the school districts have control over the board or not. I just want to make sure that we clear that up, and we can talk offline about that.
And again, each school district has some proportionate share of voting rights on who serves on the CAD, but one school district doesn't come anything close to having control unless it's a single county school district. All the school districts that would have to sort of join forces in who they choose to vote for those CAD elections.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
All right. Representative Governor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for all your time and effort and all of this. I've got several questions related to different things because I want to clear some things up to make sure I'm on the right track, and I'd love for my colleagues to hear from you about certain things. So let's talk about the school closures that's happening around the state of Texas. You know, I know we touched on it earlier. I'm wondering, can your office create a pie chart or something that shows, when we look at our school-age children, how many of kids are in charter schools? How many is in traditional public? I call it public charter and traditional public. How many students are homeschooled?
We have that. It's not a pie chart. It's just a regular chart with counts to. We don't have precise counts of homeschooling, private schooling, because it's not stuff that's reported to us, but we can estimate from various data sources. So we'll send that to your office and share that with you. But
And online.
That's right. And so we have a document that has all those numbers all on one page.
Do you happen to know offhand what those percentages are like?
I was just looking at this about over our lunch break. I will. Can you all pull that up for me, and I'll come back to you maybe later in the hearing, and I can read. I can read the numbers to you.
Seeing that picture would be helpful, and then we could estimate the number of potential students that the ESAs, based on the proposed budget. Okay, so that we can see the big picture dynamics of where our students are. I think that would be quite helpful. As it relates to school closures, and I know every community is different. I have an older community, a lot of gentrification, and so you see a lot of senior citizens. So those neighborhoods who used to be the historically African American and/or other communities are now dwindling down in enrollment because you don't have childbearing families and things like that. Plus, a lot of our older buildings, who may have been built for a population of 1,200, now only have 300. So would you agree that the efficiency piece that's happening now is part of a good thing or a bad thing? Because I'm like Rep. Wiley, when we talk to our folks about school closing, we want to be able to have accurate information so that our communities don't panic.
Yeah, I mean, if a public school closes, the students and families that were in that school are definitely experience disruption from that closure. They, whenever a school district has to consider the closure of a school, they try to think through an option that is going to be most beneficial to their families and least disruptive. It's a difficult decision to make, but in many cases, school systems are trying to think about what is the most efficient way to deliver the best resources to their kids. If a school district, if an individual campus dwindles to 200 kids in a district where all the other schools have 500-600 kids, then you get to ask questions like, well, are we going to have a counselor at that campus? Are we going to have a dedicated art teacher at that campus? And so these issues of allocation of those kinds of resources are things that districts have to think through.
Okay.
I do have the stats that you requested.
Okay.
So, we estimate that there's roughly 6.2 million children in the K through 12 age range in the state of Texas. So 5.5 of those are in either ISDs or charters, and so you can see the remainder would not be. And our best estimate is that there's 230,000 kids statewide that are in a district other than the district of their residence. So I live in Dallas and I'm attending Grand Prairie ISD. There are 422,000 kids in charter schools. There are about 50,000 kids in some flavor of a virtual school, but those are public virtual schools, like an online school.
So 1% on an online school,
Yeah.
about 9% in a charter.
I'm going to trust you on the math. I can't do that quickly in my head, but yeah,
Okay.
422 out of 6.2 million, or 422 out of 5.5 million. It depends on what you want your
Okay.
denominator to be. In private schools, the best estimate that we have is 286,000 kids in private schools, and on homeschool, the best evidence is 494,000. Those counts might not be accurate, but we're pulling them from Private School Association data or census data in various places.
So it's the most accurate information we have.
Yeah.
Is it possible to get that to all the members of the committee?
Yeah,
So
we'll
we can kind of see the breakdown?
We'll forward this to the entire committee.
Raw numbers and percentages would be helpful.
We'll have to add percentages to the chart, so we'll add percentages to the chart and then send it to the committee.
Okay, great. And as I was talking about school closures, folks are not just having children like they used to. I grew up in an era where every other house had 5 or 6 kids.
Yes,
Now-
ma'am. That's so that you could bring the demographer in here. We regularly get data from the demographer and then the national. There's some national demographic sources, and like the cohort of we'll call it 400,000 kids per cohort, like 400,000 kindergartners, except now there might be only 360,000 kindergartners. So it was about a 40,000 kid reduction in a relatively short period of time. That was like, if I'm off the top of my head, I'm doing this because I don't have the stats in front of me, but that was like the COVID reduction in birth rates. There was also a reduction in births that happened after the Great Recession, 2011.
So part of school closure is that folks are not just having the number of children that they used to have.
Yeah, we are not seeing the growth in children statewide, and in many cases you're seeing decline in populations, and that's particularly acute in the urban centers, where we're seeing decline in student populations.
Okay. And you would say that that's one of the root causes of these schools closing?
Oh, yeah, I mean, like, insufficient numbers of children is the root cause for the closure of a building.
All right. And one of the reasons, and correct me if I'm wrong, schools or districts are not getting the revenue is attendance across the nation is low in school-aged children.
So, pre-COVID to post-COVID, there has been a material shift in parental behavior related to attendance, and we're like 1.5 points down attendance rates today than we were pre-COVID, even today. And it's I've talked to superintendents to try to why do you think this has happened, but it's in part People are reacting to sniffles a lot more than they used to, keeping kids home that they may have just sent before COVID. It's in part that the behavior, there was some sort of massive behavioral change, psychological behavior change that seems to have happened, and people just don't think it's as necessary to send kids to school every day. And so this is, again, I think, feedback that I get from educators all over the state. There's like, these are their hot sports opinions as to why this has changed. So we don't know why it has changed. What we do know is attendance rates are a little bit lower today on average than they were pre-COVID.
And so it's just a little bit. It's not a major shift, but it's a little bit.
Well, I mean, a 1 percentage point reduction in average daily attendance, even with the same number of kids, is a $380 million reduction in district budgets.
Okay.
Statewide.
Okay. The other question that I have on teacher qualifications, because I know we've talked about certification, non-certification, things like that. Have y'all done any studies on teacher certification programs producing the best teachers versus individuals who come out of certain industries being the best teachers? Where can we, as a policy group, start thinking about recruiting?
Yep.
And growing our educators? What message could you give us to help us better shape what that looks like? Should we pay for credentialing?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number of studies that are focused on what kind of preparation or knowledge base an individual has that makes them then the most effective educator in the classroom. And potentially in order, content knowledge of the subject matter. So if you're teaching high school computer science, it's generally a good idea if you know something about computer science. Teaching math, generally a good idea if you know something about math. So content knowledge is sort of factor number one. Appropriate training in classroom management, how to maintain sort of discipline in the art and science of teaching. And then coaching or mentoring systems, when properly implemented, are highly effective. Those are your three key factors that, to the extent that we can make it more true for people who are aspiring to be teachers, you will see both increases in teacher retention and you will see increases in student learning.
So I could be a math whiz, not a certified teacher, but I could be effective in the classroom and I potentially can be taught classroom management.
Yeah, I think the way I would answer your question is it is not that certification as a process in and of itself is magical, but preparation is really important. And so preparation first to make sure you understand the content that you're teaching, preparation in classroom management, and then what kind of supports are given to you as an entry into the classrooms, or the mentoring and coaching that you receive.
Okay. And so that takes us to, I could possibly get an athlete who graduated who's real sharp in math, prepare them for the classroom, and because they have that coaching teamwork background, they may be an excellent teacher.
They may be.
Okay. The other questions that I have is related to the chart where you put the average amount schools get, the $15,000, that most of my colleagues disagree that is a fact. Would a better presentation be, or in addition to, what the lowest cost per pupil where schools are getting? Because we all agree the finance system is very complicated. So if I was a rural school and I had 300 students, and I know it's just not this simple, but I'm getting $10,000 per student, right? So I'm getting $3 million, easy math, right? Is it a better presentation to say our lowest per pupil amount per district is X, and our highest is that 15,000, or our average, and then what our highest, just to give people a view
Of the range.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we could certainly prepare that. In your particular example, rural schools are going to be on the higher end of the range, not the lower end of the range, the way the school finance system works. But so we're happy to prepare that and send it to you. I will say that what I heard from the discussion earlier was also a disagreement on counting different kinds of funding. So whether you should count INS as funding for schools or not. So it's clearly paid by the taxpayer. It's used to pay the debt that they use to incur on school buildings, but it is not operational funding. And so some people say that doesn't count, don't count that. We can present the data to you any way that you like. So this is just an all-in picture of all funding sources.
Right. And I think, and that's why I'm asking that we elaborate a little more so that folks can see a little bit more realistic what they're getting per pupil when they do the simple math, okay? Because no doubt we want to make integrity to our discussions.
Yeah, well, we have on our website, for those of you, I know you're regularly on the TEA website, there are PEIMS financial reports that show the certified audited financial reports of every single district in the state. So you can you type in Google TEA PEIMS financials, you can type in a district, and you can pull it up, and it will give you what their revenue was for any given year. And so I'm also happy for any of you, either I can meet with you or one of my team members can meet with you and we can pull up every district in your electoral district and just show you what the numbers are and what the different kinds of funding flows are associated with those.
Well, I think because we're making statewide decisions, I'd like to see it on the statewide piece because, those financial reports can be kind of complicated too.
Yeah, I mean, I happen to have the PEIMS financial report right in front of me, and it's got the statewide financial data right here, and it's $15,500. It says it pretty clearly. So,
right. But again, I'd like to see what the highest, middle, and the lowest.
Well, the highest are going to be all your very small rural schools because of the way the small rural formulas work, and the lowest are going to be larger school districts that have very low levels of student poverty.
Okay. Then my other question is related to the SHARS that's gone, and potentially, and I know it's potentially, if the Department of Ed went away and we lose Title I funding and or SPED dollars, are we preparing or at least looking at it from the state perspective? Because I would think then the state has to step up. And there's two schools of thought. Plan A is three schools of thought. Plan A is don't happen and we keep moving, right? Plan B is it happens and we get a block grant to the state, which then has to be administered. And then Plan C would be nothing comes from the feds. Have TA thought about that at all?
I mean, a little bit, but very little because we don't know exactly what Congress would plan to do, and we need to wait and see what that unfolds. Virtually all, not all, but most of the funding flows that we receive from the federal government actually predate the Department of Education. So the existence of the Department of Education is actually a different question of the existence and structure of those federal funding streams from the Department of Education. So I couldn't speculate what Congress will plan to do with any of that.
But to keep our educators and people's mind at ease, I love what you just said in terms of regardless if the agency exists or not, these dollars still exist. Am I hearing you correctly?
I mean, Congress can pass a law and do anything. What I'm saying is most of the funding that we receive from the federal government actually came into existence before there was a Department of Education. In fact, the largest funding flow in this green bar is not even administered through the Federal Department of Education. It's administered through the Federal Department of Agriculture. That's what pays for school lunch and breakfast for kids. So the Department of Education as a question is actually not the same as what's happening with federal money that comes to the state for public education.
And so we looked at the two federal entities where our schools would be impacted. It would be Department of Agriculture and the Department of Ed.
There are other funding flows that come from Uncle Sam and from different, like HHSC, because I think SHARS is actually, that's the Federal Human Services.
Yeah.
I can't remember but so there are a variety of different federal agencies that are involved in federal grant programs to states.
Right. And the key to it, Commissioner, is folks out here are afraid. They don't know what's going on. And it's for us as the leadership is to be able to, explain to people so they can understand better and talk them off the ledge. so that we don't have major panic around. And our biggest job is public education. And we've got to have a common voice, because I'm concerned if we're all saying something different, it's going to create more problems. And we're just going to go down this spiral of people not trusting our educational system because we're saying different things. And so I think that's why looking at that per pupil, low, middle, high, being able to have common talking points so that we're all clear that if the Department of Ed goes, hey, but Department of Ed is this, and we're watching those things, because I think we have to be heightened more now than ever before how things work. It can no longer just be, I hope y'all take care of it. We've got to begin to educate our folks so they can prepare for the good, bad, and ugly.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Representative Martinez?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon. I just have a couple of questions regarding special education. I know Texas, we faced a lot of, challenges with the funding of special education. And in 2018, I know we were fined about $33 million. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah,
There were- 'cause
for
there was
failing to comply with the Individuals and Disabilities Education Act.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then I think in 2019, when we had, in last session, I think we had a discussion about it. I think it was closer to $233 million because we had.
Yeah, that's what I was going to comment.
default.
The total amount of SPED shortfalls that we were then subsequently assessed under IDEA was well over $33 million. It was more in the $200 million range.
Right. And how have we addressed that? Has that been paid? Has that been taken care of?
Yeah,
Is there still a lingering fee out there?
Yeah,
can
that
you-
was, I think, 3 different sessions of appropriations because it took a while for Uncle Sam to actually finally assess us on the bill.
Right.
But that has now been fully resolved. The root cause of that is actually much more complex. The feds evaluate our SPED spending both by what our total SPED allocation is, the SPED allotment, which is maybe $6 billion, but then they apply a percentage analysis to that, to what is your state share versus your local share. So as you make tax policy changes, that can affect the Fed's calculation for how much they view us as spending or not spending on special education. And so prior to 2019, there was this really rapid rise in local share relative to state share. So even though SPED spending was in fact increasing in Texas, their calculation of our spending was going down and down and down because more of public education was funded out of property taxes than out of state appropriations. And that's just how that calculation works with Uncle Sam. So post House Bill 3, you have this sort of automated compression mechanism which keeps the local and state share much more in balance. So we likely have permanently solved the problem that led to those fines when they were originally levied.
And then under your exceptional items on slide 13, I know the first bullet point, talks about reforming the current funding mechanisms. Does that help in addressing that issue on special education?
I think the short answer is yes, because in part we would request that you don't just change the funding formulas, but you also substantially increase your SPED, overall SPED funding. And the feds look at this is a super shorthand, but basically, according to Uncle Sam, we can never spend less on SPED in year 2 than year 1, ever. And so as long as SPED spending is either maintaining or increasing, we'll be fine with that requirement. If it ever goes down, then I'll have to come back to you and do a sort of another appropriations request.
Right. And just another question in regard to special education. I know through the dialogue that you had earlier with my colleague, Representative Collier, we spoke a little bit about private schools and public schools. Now, private schools are not mandated to adhere to IDEA. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So only public schools have that requirement.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And then so the funding of that, and then I believe Representative Howard had mentioned this, so public schools still have to pay for that when they're doing their diagnostic testing. Is that correct?
Yeah, because if you live in the geography of a district, actually I think it might be if you attend a private school in the geography of the district and you wish to have your child evaluated, the public school is required to perform that. They're also required to provide what's referred to as equitable services. So making some of the services that they make available to students that are enrolled in the public schools also available to other students in that same geography.
Right. And then just moving on real quick to the uncertified teachers, and just for a point of clarification, when you say uncertified, does that just mean they don't have a teaching certificate, or does that mean they aren't bilingual certified? Is that encompasses?
Yeah, that's
do they not have the reading academy?
Yeah,
they're also uncertified. Are they all lumped in together?
No, yeah, that's a great question, and it's the first thing that you mentioned. They have no kind of certification whatsoever. That's what we mean by uncertified, at least for the purposes of that chart. But you're right, there are other certification complexities.
Right, and those requirements are, of course, on teachers. And my wife's a fourth grade reading and writing teacher at the Wesco School District. So I think a lot of this, when we talk about legislative mandates and looking at the exceptional item regarding teacher preparation, I'm wondering if that's only for new teachers or if that could also include Reading Academy, which was a legislative mandate that we placed in one of our House bills for our teachers that are K through third, for example. And some school districts, they may pay for it, others may not. But would that be a part of that exceptional item? And with that said, would bilingual certification also be added to that as well? Or is that included?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we are trying to surface this to have the legislature consider making improvements in all of those areas. Ultimately, it will depend upon a piece of filed legislation that attacks that problem. But we believe, we talk to our school systems on a pretty regular basis, we should have people complete the reading academies while they're getting certified before they start teaching. Right. It will significantly improve their quality of life in their first year on the job. It will also improve the quality of instruction kids receive while they're on the job. And so to the extent that we can shift that burden into teacher preparation from existing districts, would be ideal.
And I agree with that 100%, but what happens to the teachers that are already teaching that didn't go through that before?
Yeah, so the legislature, when the legislature passed the Reading Academies statute, it was part of House Bill 3 in 2019, and it came with the $800 million a year early education allotment. So districts received funding to do reading academies, to do pre-K, to do a miscellaneous set of activities. Each district had the flexibility to decide how they were going to deploy that funding. Some of them executed reading academies as part of the normal job duties of a teacher, meaning they weren't. It wasn't extra. It wasn't like nights and weekends. It was like a day of in-service, which is probably the best way to do it. Some of them required the teachers to do it on their own and provided a stipend to do it during extra time. And then some of them required the teachers to do it on their own and provided no stipend to do it. So to the extent that you want that experience to be more standardized for your teachers, to say like it either should be during in-service or it should be given a stipend, but don't just make it extra work for them with no extra pay, then you would need a statute to sort of change the way that the mandate works.
Right. Okay. And then my last question just is, and I think, our colleague here, Representative Berry, made a great point earlier about how we hear so many people talk about how poor public schools are doing. And I think that affects the morale on our teachers. I think it affects the morale on our students. I believe it has an impact on, the pressure that they have daily. How and what are we doing, or TEA, to address this? How can we work on that? And I think, I know you said something about a marketing campaign, but I think there's a lot of schools, and I know there's a lot of schools that do a very good job. Teachers work very hard day in and day out. I mean, the students that they interact with, it's a very, very tough profession. And I want to see how we can change that. And what's your recommendation that maybe we can do to make it better, to make people understand that public schools are good and they work hard? And I think it's also a testament that, Texas is ranked 43rd in education in the nation. What can we do to be number one? Everything's bigger in Texas. Everything should be better in Texas, and we are better. But how can we be number one?
Yeah.
And how can we get there?
Well, those two very large questions. I would go back to the recommendations of the Teacher Vacancy Task Force, which were really a holistic set of recommendations to improve the health of the teaching profession generally, and I think those are all worth doing. In terms of making the state number one in terms of student learning outcomes, this is a whole lot of things that have to go right. So clearly you have to have supported and well-trained teachers that have disciplined classrooms, but you have to have rigorous content. You have to have the sort of school that is structured to ensure that students can meet those learning objectives over the course of 1 year and over the course of 13 years. So to some extent the answer is easy, and to some extent the answer is profoundly complex. It's good content, good teaching, and more of it. That's how you get to be number one. It's just how do you do that across a system with 1,200 independently governed legal entities, 9,000 campuses is quite daunting.
Thank you, Commissioner. I mean, I just want to close with this, that I'm not satisfied with being 43rd. I want to be number one, and I think we can all make it happen. Thank you.
Representative Kitzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for being here today. I just got a few quick questions. One of them, or some of them, little clarification. We're told quite often that at least 1,200 people a day are moving to Texas. They weren't here before, but yet you tell us that overall our student population is flat. Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct. That is quite the conundrum.
Okay, so do you have a...
I mean, I might recommend that y'all bring the demographer or sort of get briefed from the state demographer, but I think the short answer to the question is there's less kids per adult in the state, both the people that are moving here and the people that are here. We had 4 kids. We're, the Morath family is trying to represent, but yeah, it's the number of children is essentially declining relative to the number of adults.
And speaking of decline, we've talked about schools that are having to close or losing population. Am I correct that tends to be more from the inner cities or big city urban areas moving to the suburban areas or even formerly rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have seen a concentration of depopulation with regard to students in our urban core over the last 10 to 20 years. But to say that it's isolated to the urban core, I don't think is accurate, because we have rural communities that every once in a while begin to sort of slowly decline in population. And so like it can hit this all over.
Okay. On the balance between certified teachers and uncertified teachers, if this year is a landmark that we have more uncertified teachers being hired than certified teachers, is that because there's not enough certified teachers in the pipeline, or school districts would just rather hire uncertified teachers, or what do you think the cause
that is a good
of
question. I do not think it is true that school districts would rather hire uncertified teachers.
Thank you.
That is not my experience with school districts. They would much rather hire certified teachers. There are we have data, and I'm happy to share it with you on enrollment in teacher preparation programs and how that has been shifting. But it is also important to understand the teacher preparation landscape. There's basically what you think of as teacher preparation, which I think most people think of as teacher preparation. I went to school, got my undergrad in teaching. I started up as teacher. That is pretty rare and has been exceedingly rare over the years. That's that dark blue line on this chart. The vast majority of certified teachers that have been hired over the last 20 years have been alt-certified teachers. Mm-hmm. And some of those people get prepared before they come into the classroom. Many of those people, they obtain their certification during their first year on the job, which is really not preparation. It is certification, but it's not preparation, because in order for it to be preparation, it needed to happen before you were hired. So now I've forgotten your question, but yeah, there's not enough people getting certified to satisfy the hiring demands of districts.
At that initial point, but so my follow-up to that was, and you alluded to it, we do have alternative certification programs, so those people stay permanently uncertified, or are most of them working to get their certification through alternative
So
certification
it used to
programs?
be that they would all end up getting certified. With the growth in District of Innovation and the sort of, I think there was a behavior shift when COVID hit because kind of certifications got turned off, is there's really not much incentive for a candidate to get certified now. They can be hired when they are uncertified. The districts do not require them inherently to get certified after they've been hired. And all of the costs associated with becoming certified are borne by that person.
That's correct.
It's not so I get the same pay. I'm already doing the job. Why would I spend $4,000 for the sheet of paper? This is one of the dilemmas that I think y'all face from a policymaking perspective, which is one, is this a huge problem? And I would submit to you that the lack of prepared teachers is a huge problem. And then two, how do you set up the incentives and the supports so that more people can be prepared before they start teaching full-time?
Well, that kind of brings up, I can understand a teacher that's been there for 30 years and had 30 years worth of students like I was being ready to retire. I can sympathize with that. But when we've got teachers that start out and within 3 to 5 years are already ready to leave the profession, what are your observations on why that's happening? I mean, we're here to talk about money today, but that may be part of it. But the environment and everything else, why do you think so many potential long-term teachers are not staying on the job anymore?
Yeah, I mean, this again is what the Teacher Vacancy Task Force spent about a year studying, and it's a mix of factors. Part of it is pay, part of it is professional recognition, part of it is professional growth, and professional growth means more than just pay.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is the degree of support they get. There's some work-life balance issues. I think not every school in the state is organized like this, but many schools are organized so that the job duties of a teacher are not possible to be done in less than 80 hours a week. And so if you've engineered a job that can only be done by superhumans, you should expect a lot of turnover. So that is a huge challenge. People need to have discipline because there's no teaching without a discipline in the classroom. And so part of that is making sure that the teachers themselves were trained on classroom management, but part of that is making sure the administration actually has their back in order to ensure a disciplined classroom. So it is a part of it is the resources with which I'm supposed to teach. So if I have to spend every Friday night on Google, Pinterest, or Teachers Pay Teachers to figure out what my lessons are next week, that is not a recipe for success, either for students or the adults. So the Teacher Vacancy Task Force has a set of recommendations, all of which are worthy of attention.
Well, I think we're at a crisis point. We may have the buildings and the infrastructure and everything, and we have the money that goes along with that. But if we run out of teachers, it doesn't matter how many kids we have. There's nobody there to teach the class.
I agree. And one of the things that I think is a weakness of our current state policy framework is really the state does not invest any money or resources in preparing teachers. It is all up to these people themselves to prepare themselves. And so they incur all of the costs. If you just try to make a logical decision, I can choose to pay $12,000 for this really robust preparation experience. And there's evidence that will lead me to have a better life while I'm a teacher and probably like a longer career trajectory. Or I can spend $4,000 on this thing, and my starting pay is the same no matter what I do. So most people make logical decisions, and people are making logical decisions. It just happens to be not in the best interest of the teaching profession or students.
Well, I agree with you that teaching is a calling and a passion. It starts right here, and we can't just go to the unemployment line and pick up new teachers. We need people that are passionate
That's
about
right.
it and care about and love our kids. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Representative Harrison.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. Always good to talk to you. And at the outset, I will apologize. I think my thoughts and notes were probably a little bit more structured before the break as I was scribbling down my thoughts as you were giving your testimony and answering other questions. So forgive the haphazard nature of some of the questions. I did want to follow up on one question from Representative Collier a second ago, and multiple others actually regarding this sort of the reassessments when the comptroller comes in and pulls
Yes.
the values back up. Do the taxing when that does happen, do the taxing entities have the ability to lower the rates downward? Because my understanding would be that the tax assessor would do would do new calculations for what the no new revenue rate or the max compressed rate are. Is my understanding right, or is that not accurate?
I'm going to answer to the best of my ability
Yeah.
on the question. I think the answer to your question is materially different when you're talking school districts versus every other taxing entity.
And sorry, for purposes of this discussion, let's scope it to school districts.
Yeah. So school districts do have the legal authority to lower below what's called MCR for Tier 1, and then there's a Tier 2 tax rate as well that's entirely in the discretion of school districts. And so school districts...
But real quick, they still have that flexibility or authority subsequent to the reassessment from the comptroller.
regardless what happens to
Yep.
appraised values, they have this authority
Yep.
every year. They
Thank
get
you.
to set a Tier 1 tax rate and a Tier 2 tax rate.
Okay.
Voters don't, or taxpayers don't see the difference on their tax bill, but a school board controls a Tier 2 tax rate, which you will sometimes hear referred to as golden and copper pennies. And that is completely in the discretion of the school district. And then they set their Tier 1 tax rate. The Tier 1 tax, you're able to set up to 17 pennies of Tier 2 taxes. The Tier 1 tax rate, meaning you could have 0, or you could have all 17.
On the Tier 2. And to be
on
clear,
Tier
we're
2.
talking M&O Tier 1 and Tier 2.
M&O
right?
Tier 1 and Tier 2. INS works differently.
Yeah, correct.
And so then Tier 1, we calculate every year what's referred to as MCR, the max compressed rate, and communicate that to every district. And there's a kind of a state default max compressed rate, and there's some variability in taxing jurisdictions that have high growth where their MCR might be lower. And so we communicate what MCR is to every school board in the state, and they then have the authority to set whatever they want their Tier 1 tax rate to be from 0 all the way up to that tax rate.
Yeah, and actually I had it somewhere else in my stack of questions here for you, but I'm glad you went there because one of the questions I was going to ask you that you at least partially answered right there is something that I hear very frequently from school board trustees, not just in my district, but all across the state. But I can tell you I have firsthand watched ISD superintendents, ISD CFOs brief the board, and they will say, and I'm quote, it's directly a quote, the state of Texas sets our M&O rate. And what I have seen happen at school board briefings when they're given, okay, we've got 4 options for your rate when it's rate setting time, and they'll have two variables, and one is held constant through every option, option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, but the only variable is the INS number. And I have seen heard this ad nauseum that ISDs, in fact, do not have control over their INS rate, and that the state of Texas, or probably more appropriately, you, sir, set that rate. Is that accurate?
We set the maximum rate for Tier 1, and the maximum rate for Tier 2 is set in law. That's and so the school board then chooses what to tax up to that maximum rate.
And because the M&O is broken down into Tier 1 M&O and then Tier 2 M&O, am I understanding correctly, they basically have almost near total control over Tier 2. And they do have at least, 10-15% of variance on the Tier 1. Am I close?
I would say they have the total authority to set whatever they want either of those things to be.
Okay. That's an even broader answer than I was looking for.
Yeah, the MCR that we communicate has some degree of variance from one district to the next.
Yeah.
But that's still their MCR. That's still their maximum. But they can set anything up to that maximum.
So bottom line, it is factually accurate that local school board trustees are responsible and have the ability to set their own M&O rates.
Yes, I think
That
that's
is
correct.
unambiguously true.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let me go back to this chart that's gotten a lot of attention today because this is yours. I don't know what it was in your deck, but it's 5 of your annual report.
Yep.
I think it was 4 or 3 in your deck. What I hear a lot, and I know you and I have discussed this numerous times over the years, but I think it's really important, especially we have a lot of new lawmakers in the Capitol now. What is repeated constantly is that there has not been an increase in public education funding since 2019. When people say that, I believe they're talking about the basic allotment. Is that your understanding?
That
when you hear
is what my interpretation is, because that's the only way that's an accurate statement. is
correct,
if
because
they're
otherwise
limited to
we're not
basic
even in the universe of factual,
That's
right?
correct.
Okay, because 2019 is over here, And, I'm an Aggie, so my math is what it is. But I mean, these bar charts look bigger than the ones on the left, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in fact, we've actually never spent more on public education in the state of Texas than we are right now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, and am I reading your chart right that since 2011, per pupil, so not an aggregate, so adjusted for the influx into the state of Texas, we have increased public education funding, at least in nominal terms, by 48%?
Since 2011,
Since
up
2011.
to 22-23, yes, sir.
Correct, up to 22-23, that's right. And so when people talk about the basic allotment, because that is, as you said, the only way you can make sense of the articulation, the false claim, I think objectively absurd claim that public education funding has not increased since 2019, is they have to be talking about the basic allotment. And the basic allotment is represented in this bar chart in the blue. Is that right?
No, I would not characterize that. The basic allotment is nowhere to be seen in that bar chart because the
Oh,
basic,
this is an updated one.
the basic allotment is a calculation
That's right. When we did this, so
of,
right.
of part of their entitlement.
Let me rephrase the question, then I retract that question. Right here is 6,000 on the bar chart.
I'm sorry.
Are you able to see this, Commissioner?
Yes.
Right there, my fingers. That's 6,000.
Yep.
So if I were to draw a line across here, you're right, it doesn't directly correspond to the blue, but it's slightly above the blue. That would be the BA, right?
That's the BA, yes,
So
sir.
everything above, basically what my fingers are showing here, that is on top of the basic allotment.
Yes, sir.
So these amount of funds, the weights and the adjustments, they have increased substantially since 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah. In fact, what is really not all that well known is that there is in fact an automatic inflationary adjustment in the school.
Yeah,
finance formula.
can you explain that to the committee, please?
It's so a piece of the school finance formulas is indexed to the 96 percentile of wealth per student, and specifically what's indexed is the golden penny yield. And so the value of each golden penny levy, these are the tier 2 taxes that we talked about before, that value has been increasing automatically since 2019 every year.
So when I hear the claim that funding for public education has stayed flat since 2019, even though inflation has increased, that is a true or a false statement?
Funding has increased since every year since 2019.
Even on a per pupil basis?
On a per pupil basis and on an aggregate basis, both. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to juxtapose these staggeringly high increases in state funding on a per pupil basis for public education in Texas with student outcomes, because I think when a lot of people learn, first of all, they're shocked to learn that public education funding per pupil has increased 48% since 2011. What they're more surprised by, and what I was shocked when I learned initially, is when you juxtapose that over student outcomes, not only is the trend, or is the correlation not one-to-one, the correlation is not even positive. And forgive me, I'm going to look at the NAEP data right here, and I'm sure you're aware that NAEP recently updated their numbers. Since 2011, so going through the same time period of here, Texas 8th grade math performance has not only not increased a commiserate 48%, it hasn't increased at all. In fact, it has declined approximately 40%, from around 40% proficiency for Texas 8th graders in math to approximately 24-25% proficiency Texas 8th graders in math. Does that track with your understanding of the data?
It does.
Okay, so when on a per pupil basis, funding was 48% lower than it is right now, math scores were actually 40% higher. Does that track with your understanding?
Yeah.
Okay. So that is something that policymakers really should grapple with, that necessarily just throwing more money without reforms is probably something we should not run headfirst into doing.
Yeah, and that I would say is consistent with my lifetime of study of this space. And I'll explain it to you. I'll give you an example as to why practice changes are so profoundly important and not the same as money changes. Which isn't to say that money doesn't matter. The only people that work for free in public education are school board members. Everybody else is getting paid.
Yep.
But let's say you got a kindergarten classroom in year one. You got a teacher in that kindergarten classroom. There's 22 kids in the classroom. And let's say that the instructional materials that kindergarten teacher uses encourage students to guess at what letters mean. Let's just posit that is a hypothetical situation.
Yep.
In the next year, you can do one of two things in the next year. You can double the amount of money spent on that classroom so that you make it 2 classroom teachers, all getting the same amount, same salary, but now only teaching 11 kids. But they're now still doing the same lessons on teaching kids to guess at what letters mean rather than, or what words are, rather than to sound them out, rather than phonics. So in that situation, you have doubled your expenditure, but you should not expect any improvement in reading proficiency whatsoever.
Correct.
Because the reading practices are the wrong practices. If, however, instead of doubling the expenditure to reduce class sizes in half, you get them to buy different reading material, different lessons, so that the next year they are using lessons that are phonics-based, you will see reading proficiency improvements. And now they had to spend money on the materials. That's not going to be double your cost. It's going to be a fraction of that cost. And you will see substantive improvements over time. So again, in both cases, you actually did spend a little bit of money.
Yep.
In one case, you spent a lot of money and didn't get anything for it. And in one case, you spent a little bit of money and got a lot for it. So these are, I think, when y'all apply your policymaking lens, it is both a question of like how much, but it's also a question of what.
Right.
Like what is being done with the money.
Right, so it's the whole definition of insanity, right? Just
Yeah.
doing the same thing over and expecting different results, and objectively true. And again, we could spend time parsing out the various variables that have explanatory power versus those that don't, but it is objectively true that since 2011, public education per pupil funding has increased 48% in nominal terms, but math scores among Texas 8th graders have plummeted 40% over the same time period.
That's correct.
Okay. And I can hear I can feel some of my colleagues up here just screaming that I'm not talking about inflation enough. I do want to ask you a question. I know the LBB is coming up in a second, so maybe I probably shouldn't give them a heads up. I'll probably ask them the same question. But I am a little confused because when I see some inflation-adjusted charts, and I've seen lots of economists, both inside the government as well as many outside organizations, do their sort of inflation adjustment numbers. Let me ask it this way, very foundationally. Is there a difference between the way TEA does their inflation adjustments and the way the LBB does their inflation adjustments when we're talking about growth in public education spending?
I think it depends on which LBB report, but there are certain circumstances where, yes, we're doing the same, and certain circumstances where, no, we're not necessarily doing the same. What you will, and again, I think it depends on which LBB report. Our goal is to give you the same information, but
Yeah.
you can make different decisions.
So when they did their fiscal size up recently,
Yeah.
does that help?
I need it in front of me, but I think that one in particular is looking at a inflationary adjustment that assumes both. It's looking at total spend,
Yep.
and then it is assuming growth in the student population and CPI.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the issue, because I have seen some where it looks like on the surface, if you adjust for inflation, the numbers are flat or maybe down just a little bit. But my understanding is that the LBB, when they do their inflation calculations, they're multiplying it by the growth in the population of the entire state as opposed to the growth
That's
in
right.
the student population. Does that track with does that track with your understanding? And B, is that different than the way TEA does
Yeah,
it?
we've seen that, and you can do it that way. We think the more accurate way, if you're trying to factor in inflation, is to convert all the numbers into per pupil counts, and then only apply inflation to that, and then you can reconvert based upon the total number of students. And the reason for this is it used to make logical sense to take total state spending and then offset it from an inflation perspective, both by CPI and student population growth, or total population growth of the state. But as you heard me testify to earlier,
Yep.
those two things got disconnected about 5 years ago.
Pretty significantly, right?
Pretty
The
significantly.
overall growth in population among Texas residents is now diverging in a
student growth.
in a statistically significant way from the growth in the student population.
That's right. So we think you should, if you're ever going to do an inflationary analysis, you always want to base that inflationary analysis on a per pupil analysis.
Right.
because
So at least
factors that out.
And I am readily acknowledge you don't have the chart in front of you, but at least qualitatively, if one was conducting an inflationary analysis using population growth of the entire state, that would
Overstate inflation.
It would overstate inflation and understate the extent to which public education funding on a per pupil basis has in fact been happening.
I think that's right.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. Okay, one thing there has been a lot of discussion about, and I'm aware, or at least maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that TEA has an official position on this. It is absolutely a policy question, but I would welcome your expertise on when we grapple about how should we modify funding formulas in the state of Texas. And one in particular that has gotten a lot of headlines recently is whether we should switch, as many states admittedly do, to a funding formula that is based on enrollment as opposed to ADA or WADA. And I know I have concerns about a switch like that, but I would be very interested in your perspective on that, particularly as it may or may not impact the people we should be caring about the most here, which is the students.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I do see a lot of interest in this topic. To set the stage, part of the school finance system is attendance-based, but part of it is also enrollment-based. And interestingly, the largest part that is enrollment-based is funding for low-income kids. So this is referred to as compensatory education in our funding formulas. And so if you have a low-income child, that child needs to be at school one day in the school year. And if that child is in school one day in the school year, you get about $1,800 for that child, period. But the rest of the funding, not the rest, but a lot of the rest of the funding formula is then based on average daily attendance. We are one of maybe 7 states that has an ADA-based system. The other states will either have a single enrollment window or like 3 enrollment windows. And the conclusion that I come from when I look at the data comparing that is that we have a much lower attendance absenteeism rate than other states. Stated higherly, we have a higher school attendance than the enrollment-based states, and we have a lower chronic absenteeism.
And you have data that bear out that contention.
Yeah,
okay.
and now everybody's attendance rates got worse post-COVID. Everyone's has, yep. But I also think that ours are recovering slightly faster than the rest of the country's. And it makes sense because every single school district in the state is working to make sure kids are in school every single day because they have to. In other states, they want to, but they don't have to. And that does affect school behavior. And so my general perspective is if you switch to enrollment-based funding, it's going to be disproportionately harmful for your most at-risk kids. Because they will.
Can you say that one more time?
If you switch to an enrollment-based funding model, it'll be disproportionately harmful for your most at-risk kids because they will likely end up in school less often. Because we've seen the same thing happen in other states that used to be attendance-based and switched to enrollment. So the other thing about a switch to enrollment-based funding from attendance-based funding, which I don't think is often discussed, is are you doing that in a way that is just funding neutral, like I'm just changing the way the formulas work, so we're going to do it on enrollment based upon attendance? Or am I doing that and I'm trying to put a whole bunch of money into the system? Because if it's funding neutral, what you will end up doing is half the school districts will see their funding go down because they have higher rates of attendance today. And half of the school districts will see their funding go up because they have lower rates of attendance.
And I want to pull that just real quick, in addition to highlighting the fact that you just said twice now that switching to an enrollment-based formula could actually not just harm students on average, but it could disproportionately harm the students who are economically disadvantaged or have greater levels of hardships than other students. And that if we switch to that, it's not the case that every school district in Texas would receive more money, but actually a large number, potentially up to half of ISDs, could actually see on net their funding decrease if we switch to this policy. Is that what you just testified to?
That's right, depending upon how you implement the policy change. Okay. Now, I will say that this request comes from a rational place because people want stability in their budgets. They have certain costs that are hard to vary. But to the extent that you wanted to address that, you could actually do that by adding money to the comp ed allotment, which is already enrollment-based, and which is a very stable, predictable
And I want to highlight that too. You did gloss over it pretty quick, but it's actually not accurate to say that no part of our funding formula is already enrollment-based.
That's correct. Okay. Part of it is attendance-based, part of it's enrollment-based. There's also district reimbursement of costs. There's a variety of funding mechanisms in statute.
Okay. Very helpful. To switch gears, one topic that has, I took note, has been brought up several times here today, including in your testimony, and it's reflected in your most recent annual report in the green at the top of the bar chart on page 5, is this issue of federal dollars. And I very much appreciated you elucidating for the committee that there are numerous sources for that. It is definitely not just the Department of Education. The Department of Agriculture, my old agency, the Department of Health and Human Services, and others bring significant funding down here to the state of Texas, and that a lot of those were congressionally appropriated prior to the existence of the Department of Education. But one thing that happened in COVID, there were a lot of things that happened in COVID, but one of the things was a massive surge of dollars from the feds down here. And you see that, you can't miss it, when you look at the year-over-year longitudinal data. It's my understanding, but tell me if I'm wrong, or I'll just phrase this as a question. Were the ISDs in any way instructed by TEA or other elements of the state government that, hey, the federal government is going to be sending a lot of COVID, ESSER, et cetera, dollars, but we are cautioning you against either expending or budgeting or planning on expending these funds for anything that would be an ongoing expense? Were districts given any kind of warning like that?
Yes.
Can you detail that?
One, virtually every hearing that this legislative body did, whether you're in the House or Senate, this came up all the time. Not that superintendents and CFOs glue themselves to the TV to watch your hearings. Please don't take that personally.
We're all very offended.
Two, I convened a first daily, then weekly, then monthly superintendent call to try to keep superintendents and other school leaders sort of up to speed on what was going on. And so we covered that dozens of times in the superintendent call. We also did regional trainings. We also made it a grant requirement for them to formally acknowledge that this was one-time money and for them to discuss this at a public board meeting. So it was very extensively communicated.
And those were direct communications from TEA to superintendents regionally or all across the state?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Did this happen on multiple occasions, those instructions to the superintendents?
Yeah, I mean, 50 times, 100 times.
50 times, 100 times.
A lot of times.
Okay.
And again, in order for them to access the federal funds, they had to actually acknowledge this was one time, and they had to do so in a public board meeting.
Okay. That's really enlightening, because one thing that I hear constantly is that one of the reasons we have these deficit issues, and it's been said numerous times today, one of the things that is mentioned as a cause of that is the reduction in federal funding. But this was always known. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is very much a foreseen fiscal problem.
So I guess the question I would ask for your just assessment, how do you think the ISDs have done given that admonition from the state government? The 50 to 100 admonitions.
We performed also as part of this. We required the districts to report to us the nature of their expenditure data. Was this one time or was this recurring? And they didn't necessarily have to do it every time. So there's some holes in our data.
Okay.
But ballpark half of the data that half of their spending was allocated to things that were recurring costs, and about half of that one-time money was allocated to one-time costs.
So are you testifying here today that up to as much as 50% of the federal funds that everybody knew, even casual observers, and that the ISDs must have known because A, you instructed them between 50 and 100 times, and they had to sign documentations attesting to their understanding, up to half of the federal dollars were expended on ongoing and or recurring expenses?
Yeah, that's the best evidence that we have.
Okay. Thank you for that. A different topic you mentioned during your testimony, and I think the words you used, if I typed my notes right, where you said strategic teacher compensation. You said, did I get that right in your testimony? Okay. So I want to question about that, because I care a lot about prioritizing teachers. I have read the data, and the peer-reviewed literature that I have reviewed seems to indicate that the variable with the highest explanatory power for the educational outcomes of a student is on the caliber and the quality of the teacher. And I've got tremendous concerns that ISDs themselves are not prioritizing teachers, and that a woefully insufficient percentage of education tax dollars are getting to the classroom. So as we, the legislature, as the policy-making body of the state, is grappling with how to compensate teachers, how to create or incentivize better outcomes, how to enhance our spending on teachers, I think it's really important that we do it in a way that gets us the biggest return on that expense. So I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase the question to you, but what kind of advice might you give to us if we are going to increase compensation for teachers specifically, not just public education in general, but for teachers, and we're going to increase the expense? What thoughts might you have for the legislature to ensure that we can maximize the ROI on that through things like performance-based compensation, the TIA, et cetera? What advice might you have to us on that?
Yeah, I think thankfully we actually already have an answer to this in Texas, because Texas has something pretty unique in the teacher incentive allotment. So the evidence that we have today is that the retention benefit of the teacher incentive allotment is about 8 percentage points. Sort of stated alternatively, TIA designated teachers stick around at 8% higher rate than all other teachers in the state. They also inherently, by definition, have higher student outcomes. And so those are both really good things.
And you would put those both in your terms was strategic teacher comp. That would be more strategic. Yeah. And you would think might lend it to a higher ROI than maybe less strategic increases in funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think anything that you do that takes TIA and sort of builds and expands upon it, makes it easier for districts to access. This could be some funding for administration, because it does take work to fairly evaluate teachers. But helping districts access TIA, offer it to all of their teachers, increase the level of funding in TIA, increase even the total number of levels in TIA. You heard me talk earlier. There's 3 current performance bands. Mm-hmm. You could add a 4th performance band and sort of help even more teachers gain access to it. So I think that kind of investment, we already have pretty clear evidence, is really profoundly positive in terms of its impact on teacher longevity and student outcomes.
And I don't want to spend too much time on this topic. That's incredibly helpful, and I appreciate that. And I think the governor used some precision in his language when he talked about increasing median or average. I think he said average teacher pay. Can you spend just a couple sentences on how are we compensating teachers, entry-level teachers, versus how is the compensation compared to other states with the mean teacher compensation?
This is I think a pretty important question, and one that is not oft understood. And before I answer this question, I'm going to say a couple of numbers here. And for all of you that represent rural districts, you're not going to believe these numbers because they're not actually true in rural Texas, because rural Texas is about $5,000 to $10,000 lower than everywhere else. And I can talk about that too. But if you are anywhere in a population center in the state of Texas, starting teacher pay these are all set by local districts, but starting teacher pay is going to be about $60,000 today.
So just to be clear, we're talking 22 years old, right out of school, yeah. $60,000.
That's right. That's generally what starting teacher pay is in the population centers today. And it's going to vary to plus or minus $3,000, but that's generally correct. Now, in rural Texas, it's at least $10,000 less than that for you rural members, and I have some thoughts on what you might do to address that as a sidebar. But if I pull up a district's salary schedule, they're all a little different. But I did this once recently for a decent-sized district in the greater Houston area, and its starting teacher pay was 61, and a 20-year veteran, their salary schedule was at 71. Mm-hmm. And so it is that is the actual. So
we're paying people with 20 years of experience, probably far greater student outcomes, making 9, 10, 11,000 more than somebody who's been in the classroom for the first time right out of school.
Yeah, and I think really the most fundamental problem with teacher compensation is not starting pay. It is that teachers basically never get a real raise.
And this is what I really wanted to get at this. Yeah. Because I think there are going to be some proposals, you don't have to weigh in, but there are going to be some proposals that focus on just boosting initial pay. But from my understanding of the data, and I think my understanding is consistent with your testimony so far, that may not be the most targeted or strategic way to do it. It may not be the tactic that maximizes ROI, and it might not even be getting at the heart of the issue,
Yeah,
which
it
is where you
could
just
actually exacerbate the problem of we have a really flat.
how
teacher schedule.
how might it exacerbate the problem?
Well, because so think about turnover rates in districts generally. They have been rising. They're about 3 percentage points higher today than they were pre-COVID, which means you're generally going to have more starting teachers than you have experienced teachers today than just a few years ago. And so if you boost entry-level starting pay, you create actually more fiscal pressure that prevents you from trying to address the problem of giving people additional raises while they're there. So, the thing that we think is generally most strategic is both in terms of how you might allocate resources to districts, but then how they themselves organize their salary schedules, is you got to have it where there is some degree of differential based upon performance for how much raises are earned. And you got to have much bigger pay raises than $300 for everybody. Some people get $3,000, some people get nothing as a pay raise, because again, your performance differentials between people are substantive. And if you can move the compensation system into that direction, you could see serious impacts. And let me state this one other way. There have been a lot of historic studies on performance-based compensation, both of teaching and in other professions. And it is not true that paying people for performance makes them better at their job in skill-based professions like teaching. You do not have a situation where a teacher's like, if they paid me 10 grand more today, I'd work harder. That's not the way our teachers are wired. That is not true. What is true, however, is you will have them in the classroom longer if you can increase the raises that they are given. That is the crux of a strategic change in compensation.
Great. Tremendously helpful responses. I appreciate it a lot. One thing that you just glossed over, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly, though. It is the local ISDs that set teacher salaries. Is that right?
It is.
So there's nothing the state is doing that stops ISDs from increasing teacher pay. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more. I'll try to go quickly. The funding formulas you have in your testimony, you mentioned are insanely complex. I think those are your words, but either way, I think any rational person would look at that and say that they're insanely complicated. Policy implications aside, because there would be significant policy implications to what I'm about to ask you about, but would it not just be objectively true that if we moved from the current funding formula to a truly universal ESA program where every child just sort of by default was given an ESA with X dollars in it, and the parents could direct where that went, that would be a massive simplification to how we fund public education in the state of Texas?
Yes, I think that would, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I agree. One question on accountability, because that's come up a couple times, and A through F scores. Especially this comes up especially frequently in the school choice debates with what type of accountability do non-ISDs have. Why am I not seeing A through F data for the past several years on ISDs? Why am I not getting this? Why do my constituents not know this?
Yeah, I'm legally required to issue A through F ratings every year.
Why aren't you doing it?
And I have been enjoined from doing so by Travis County District Court for the last 2 years.
Why have they enjoined you?
In 2023, we were sued by what grew to a coalition of about 120 school districts. And in 2024, we were sued by what grew to a coalition of about 30 districts.
Why, if they care, as their associations down here tell us, they care so much about accountability and transparency, why are they suing you from releasing their accountability scores to the people who need them the most, parents?
I don't know that I would want to opine on the plaintiff's motives. They have, in fact, filed a bunch of these in briefs. I think the essence of their argument is they did not think that we gave them enough advance notice of changes in accountability rules.
Okay. Two more real quick. One, picking up off another question, and I wish I could find the chart in front of me right now, but this chart does hit it too. This $15,500 number has come up a bunch of times, and there's been some complaints that INS is included in that. I'm going to ask a very question that might sound on the surface extraordinarily pedantic, but just bear with me. Are buildings free?
They are not free.
And they're not free in my understanding either. Do charter schools and private schools and quite frankly every other entity have to include their capital outlays in their cost of doing business or in their operating expenses?
they do.
So is there any real reason why ISDs should be allowed to pretend that their money for their capital outlays isn't actually a cost that's going to educating students, especially given that the money to fund them comes from taxpayers for the purposes of education?
Yeah. As a former school board member, I've always taken the perspective that INS is part of the budget because taxpayers pay it.
Taxpayers pay it for the purpose of educating students, right?
Yeah.
And part of the way to do that is to have a building for them to sit in, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One question, I think this is my last one that I wrote down. Given that we're already spending, and I know TEA, you and I have had this discussion, sometimes your TEA chart looks like 15,503. There is a TEA chart that I actually use a lot that shows it almost 17,000.
Yep.
You and I have had discussions about that. But however you get there, whether it's 15,500 or 17,000, that is the total dollars that the state of Texas objectively is spending per student in the state of Texas. Is that accurate? That is just
according to the best accounting data we have. Yes.
right. So unambiguously true. The state of Texas per pupil is spending between 15.5 and 16.8 or 9. Okay. Given that we're doing that, and there's a lot of discussion about increasing the basic allotment, can you just help the committee when people, and there's going to be a lot of policy proposals and legislative proposals to increase the basic allotment. If we were, just give us some shorthand here, help us do math on the back of an envelope. If we were to increase the basic allotment by $1,000, and if you have any other shorthands, I'd appreciate it. How much money, how much increase, how much more money would our constituents have to pony up if we were to do that? Given that we already spend around $100 billion.
$7.5 billion per year.
For a 1,000?
For a $1,000 increase in BA. Basically, every dollar of increase in the BA is $7.5 million.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
All right, Representative Garcia Hernandez.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman. I was about to say Speaker, and thank you, Commissioner. I represent House District 115, that's northwest corner of Dallas County, and I'm a proud product of public education. I went to schools in rural Texas, so I've been part of schools that were recipients of recapture, and now I have the honor of representing 3 school districts that are recapture districts. 4 districts in total, but 3 of them are recapture. Earlier this morning, you talked a little bit about as far as the sentiment, and I just wanted to make sure that there was, some clarification in at least the conversations that I've had with my recapture districts. And of course, I don't represent all recapture districts in Texas, but my feel from my school districts, my parents, my trustees, my superintendents, is that they don't necessarily believe that they shouldn't help in making sure that all students across Texas have a great education. I think the biggest concern is that all 3 of those recapture districts are actually ended up operating in deficit budgets in their own school districts. So they've sent massive amount of money back in recapture to the state of Texas. I represent Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD, Capel ISD, and Dallas ISD, just a small portion. But of course, I'm sure you're aware, Carrollton Farmers Branch, or actually both Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD and Capel ISD, they're one of the top 20 schools that sent back as far as amount of money
Dollar
that they
value,
sent back.
yeah.
And then Dallas ISD is one of the top 5. And so substantial amount of money. We've got school closures. Capel just closed one right before the election in November. We've got Dallas ISD as well, has had to cut back on some stuff and cut back on some programs as well. And now we've got Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD, which is already just announced that they're going to need to close 4 school districts. And so I know we were talking extensively about, obviously, the fact that less children are attending school. We're seeing that happen as well. But of course, I think also a big concern of this is the amount of recapture money that the school districts are having to send back. Capel ISD, I'll give you an example. I'm sure you're aware, a very high-performing school district, just like Representative Howard represents one as well. Very fiscally conservative elected officials there, especially their trustees. They do a phenomenal job of making sure that they constantly are setting factors and making sure that they're hitting their markers, but also being very responsible about the taxpayer money that they have. I had a couple of concerns about as far as in regards to the recapture system.
So I'm sure that you're aware, back in 1993, whenever the recapture program was created, back in that day, there was, I think, a little over 3 dozen of school districts that actually constituted recapture districts based off what the formula was.
Right.
Now that has essentially gone up to over 160 school districts, I think, at this time, the last time I checked, give or take around that. So all of these school districts are also, I think the last time I checked, at least maybe almost all of them are operating under deficit budgets the last session, and now forecasted to be operating in deficit budgets for these school years as well. So I had a couple things that I had questions about regarding that. One of the big concerns about the school districts, like I said, isn't necessarily helping other students across Texas to have access to a great education. But whenever we're having to deal with those deficit budgets, closing schools, consolidating programs, I'm sure you're aware of this as well, the insurance that they have to pay on insuring their buildings has also been a concern that even us as just homeowners are grappling with right now. And then, of course, like we were talking about, getting certified teachers. A substantial amount of our teachers in our districts are uncertified, which makes sense with the data that you presented today. And then, of course, with the teachers that they do have, getting them in, retaining them, keeping them happy, and more importantly, paying them what they deserve. So a lot of these things are obviously big concerns of those districts. I just wanted to make sure that we clarify that these recapture districts aren't necessarily saying that they don't want to be part of making sure that we have that common goal of students, serving students across Texas. But whenever you literally are seeing them send massive amounts back to Austin and also not being able to service and take care of their own children in their district and grappling with all of these issues, it becomes really tough, especially for our trustees.
Yeah.
I don't envy Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD trustees right now. They're having to explain to all of their 4 schools that they've already essentially are looking at to close of why they have to make that tough decision. But with that in mind, I'm also aware of to what extent that recapture has essentially become a major source of revenue for the state. And by that I mean not necessarily just for public education, but my understanding is that recapture funds do not stay in education. The excess of, and please educate me on this if I'm misstating, the excess of what the recapture districts send back, whatever is in excess of what's needed, essentially goes into the general revenue portion of the budget, which essentially the state of Texas can use for whatever purposes that they want. That is another big concern for recapture districts, is making sure that if in fact the reason that we are sending money to the state of Texas to take care of public education students, then it should be earmarked and specifically used only for educational purposes. For recapture districts like mine, who are operating in deficit budgets, to what level that we get over whatever it is that we need in order to meet that goal, and then send it back based off in what proportion each recapture district provided to go back to their districts to be used, I think would be a way better purpose of how we could potentially fix or improve the recapture system.
Yeah.
And so if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear just your input on just some of the
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. So, one, it is not true that recapture funds go into general revenue. In the annual report this year, if you look at page 5, we actually put the statutory citation. So, Texas Education Code, Chapter 49, 154B. The legislature essentially has already addressed this problem, I don't know how long ago, but those are dedicated funds and can only be used for the foundation school program. So they do not go into general revenue. I think as Representative Howard mentioned earlier, that may mean that general revenue that would have gone into the foundation school program goes somewhere else, but that's a different story. So I sometimes hear school districts surface the same concern to me. That concern's not based in fact. The recapture funds go directly to the foundation school program. It's the only place they're allowed to be spent. A few other details about recapture, though, is there is a provision in law that allows school districts to, rather than opt into recapture going into the foundation school program generally, they can actually just set up a kind of a bilateral deal and send it directly to another school district. There is not a single district in Texas that uses that provision, but it does exist. There used to be districts that used that provision because many years ago there used to be a slight financial benefit to districts that use that, but that financial benefit was removed, and so now they all basically give it to the foundation school program directly because it's administratively the easiest thing for school districts to do, and there's no financial benefit to do something more complex. But if you wanted to improve the sort of transparency of the directness of recapture funds so that Carrollton Farmers Branch, when they're paying their recapture bill, they know it's going to help some, say, poor school system in the valley or wherever, you could potentially bring that financial incentive back, and then you would see more school districts do those bilateral transfers under the system. And then I think the last thing that I would mention is Senate Bill 2. I can't remember who surfaced this with me, but Senate Bill 2 delivered more property tax relief than was originally estimated, a lot more. It was like $4 billion more. And so there were a decent number of districts that paid recapture before Senate Bill 2, and then they don't anymore. One example that happened off the top of my head is Houston had a recapture bill that was something like $175 million, and post Senate Bill 2, it was $0. And so recapture went down everywhere, and some districts got knocked out of recapture entirely because of Senate Bill 2 compression. But sort of to prove the point that recapture is only a funding source for the foundation school program, there was $4 billion of extra tax relief, which effectively means there's a $4 billion increase in the foundation school program over what was originally budgeted by the legislature. But there was there was some underspending in the foundation school program due to ADA projections coming in different and some other sort of property value projections. So there was such a reduction in recapture that the legislature actually, in the supplemental appropriations bill, I think y'all are wrestling with this, will actually have to put more general revenue into the foundation school program because recapture got reduced so much more. So recapture is clearly only allowed to be used in the foundation school program. If you're trying to consider ways to reduce recapture, obviously the legislature could entertain a complete elimination, but from my perspective, I don't think the courts will allow you to do that because we think this stems from a constitutional requirement to have roughly equalized wealth levels result in equalized resources in school districts. You could potentially increase the band of difference that is allowed from taxation from one district to another. So essentially, if your recapture districts can have a slightly lower MCR than everybody else, they will end up collecting less in property taxes, and you will see a reduction in recapture. Broadly speaking, for recapture to go down, entitlement needs to go up, enrollment needs to go up, or property taxes need to go down. One of those three things has to happen, or some combination thereof. I'll also note one more sort of nitty-gritty nuance detail related to recapture in the school finance system. Mm-hmm. School boards, as Representative Harrison asked me about, school boards have control over setting tax rates. They also have control over what's called a local optional homestead exemption. You will sometimes hear this abbreviated as LOHE. So just as y'all have like a $100,000 exemption for everybody, individual school boards can, on top of that, give another 20% off the top of a house's value as a local homestead exemption. If you are a non-recapture district and you, as a school board, decide to adopt a LOHE, you will give a lot of tax relief to your taxpayers, but your budget will be reduced by that exact same amount. If, however, you are a recapture district and you offer a LOHE, we reduce your recapture payment to offset the LOHE budget shortfall in your district. So to some extent, recapture districts get a higher level of per pupil funding if they have adopted LOHE relative to a lower tax burden on their voter base because of that specific nugget of detail in the school finance system.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, Representative Manuel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, I had a couple of questions I want to ask, because it's going to go back to before we went on break. You talked about IDD services, which is really, really IDD services, which is really, really important to me. And you said earlier that if a school district has more of a need with IDD services, that they will basically get that money. Like, there'll be more money that will be put into the district, obviously per student.
I should probably offer a clarification.
Okay.
If you conduct an evaluation under federal law and you determine that a student is eligible for special education, let's say you had that student before special education, you have that student, now they're in special education. You will begin getting special education funding formulas for that child once that evaluation is done. That may not be enough to cover the cost of the special education services, and if those services change, you still get the same amount of money from the state. But it is true that the state provides slightly more, between slightly and a lot more money per child for students in special education than students not in special education.
Okay, so just a broad base, I know you can't give me an exact number because it is different per student. What is that range per student, like for someone who has autism, for someone who has Down syndrome?
Yeah,
I know within autism there is a huge different scale of.
I probably need to follow up with you to give you specifics, but I think like order of magnitude, this number's probably correct. It's anywhere from about $1,500 per student to $20,000 per student.
Okay, so it just depends on the severity.
Yeah.
So also, those funds that are being allocated, because we also understand they do go to teachers, they also go to food lunch programs, they go to aids, different things of that sort. Of the money that's given, let's say $1,500 to $20,000, whatever the dollar amount is, how much of that is where are those funds exactly allocated when it comes to children with IDD?
Sure. So state law requires that 55% of the SPED allotment is spent on SPED services, which means 45% of funding received under the SPED allotment is more discretionary and can be spent sort of any way, anyhow.
As long as this is within that SPED part of it.
That's the, well, I mean, technically no. Like they can spend it, 55% has to be spent on SPED services, 45% can be spent on anything.
Okay.
And now districts generally spend more than their SPED allotment on SPED services. So they're usually taking from their regular program allotment, the general education funding, and using that to supplement SPED expenditures. But the state law requirement is that a minimum of 55% of the SPED allocation be spent on SPED services.
Okay. And then if any of the schools that you all have in a conservatorship right now, when it comes to their resources for IDD, have any of them been either reallocated, redistributed? Have they had anywhere where anything has been eliminated, or people have been moved around in those conservatorships? And if so, why is that?
I'm going to attempt to answer. If this is not the answer, if this is not the question you asked, then ask.
Well, I'm wondering if specifically if there are any school districts that you all have right now in your conservatorship where there has been, let's say, a reallocation, refunding, elimination of anything within the IDD services.
No, in fact, it's usually the opposite. So if you have a conservator, it doesn't change the revenue stream that you receive from the state.
Sorry, not the
total
not
revenue.
the funding.
Yeah.
Talking about
the local expenditures.
Yes,
Yeah,
because they report to you now if they're in the conservatorship about what happens. So I'm saying, like, let's say if there's an IDD service, if that IDD service is reallocated or put into a different place, would you be notified of that, and has that happened within the last 5 years at all?
Yeah. So typically, if you have a conservator for special education, you are probably going to see increased expenditures made in that district for special education writ large. You would undoubtedly see a number of changes in how special education is being spent in those districts, because you don't get a conservator for special education because everything is going well. So there's going to have to be some change in the practices in those districts, and the conservators will work with the district to come up with an improvement in the delivery of special ed services. I am unaware of the case that there's ever been a reduction in SPED spending in a district. that has a conservator for SPED. I think it's actually the opposite. They usually end up spending more.
Right, or, okay. I'm gonna get back to that because my thing is, of your training for teachers who are not experienced with someone who has IDD.
Gen ed teacher that has a special education student in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So for any of those funds, that's all gonna come out of this $1,500 to $20,000 for the training for a teacher specifically on how to deal with the type of autism that a child has or Down syndrome. All of that is still gonna come out of that $1,500 to $20,000.
Or another funding bucket from the
Or another
district.
funding
Because
bucket.
again, most of our districts are spending more in special education than they receive in revenue dedicated to special education. So they're usually then spending something from their general fund on SPED-related services.
So I'm gonna go back to one question I had asked because I guess, and I'm pretty sure you may not know the number of this offhand. Do you know how many school districts have specific IDD services within their school district? Not special education, I'm talking about specifically
intellectually
IDD
disabled
services.
students,
Yes,
specifically.
specifically those students. That's who I'm talking about specifically.
And so I definitely don't know off the top of my head, but I can research this. I just want to make sure I understand the question to research. You want to know
if any of those people have, so I'm gonna kind of cut to the chase. There is a school district where you did have IDD services that isn't a conservatorship, which is why I had asked. And that service was completely disbanded and moved into multiple places. And also teachers were let go who were training teachers on how to do this. So I guess the issue for me is if we're getting more dollars, if IDD services are considered of top priority because these students do need that help, and we're also having problems trying to keep teachers who have been in the industry for more than 10 years. Anyone who's been teaching an IDD who is a part of any kind of IDD services have been there for more than 10 years. If they're in a conservatorship, I would think you would know about it because I know about it. And there has been an IDD service that has been completely almost disbanded except for 2 people where they had more than multiple people who were teaching teachers about how to interact with a child who has IDD, because some of those children, as I know you're aware of, some of them have autism and they're in a class with someone where if they have a moment where they're not feeling comfortable, it can set off another child. And then they have to try to bring the classroom into a much more stasis. And so that's why I was asking that question to see if you knew about that, because there is a school district that is under conservatorship where you almost that the school district through the conservatorship pretty much banned and disbanded the IDD services except for an administrator and an administrative assistant.
So this sounds like a substantive reorganization of how services are being delivered, and it sounds specific to one school district. So what I think I'd like to do, if you'll permit me, is let's set up a sort of a specific meeting to discuss what's happening in that district.
Okay.
So that you can get your questions answered. I can then get fully briefed from my team on what the changes were.
Yeah, that would be great because it's been almost 2 years without an IDD service that's teaching teachers and people and other people within the school district how to properly teach and educate children who are our most vulnerable of all the children that we have.
Yeah, my assumption is students are still receiving services potentially in a different fashion than they were before. But
they've been grouped into special education, and special education is not IDD. I have dyslexia and ADHD. That's special education. IDD is something very completely different.
Okay. Well, why don't we set up a meeting where we can go into detail on that topic?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Representative Deayala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you. I'm not going to retread over. You've been here a long time. I do want to hone in on one thing. First, I want to thank you. This is my second term. Your office has been tremendously responsive, sometimes on very short notice, as you have yourself when I have questions or data requests or anything like that. I want to thank you and your staff for that first.
Thanks, sir.
Second, if we could hone on LOHI just a little bit. So 2 of my main school districts in my district, HISD and SBISD, are historically have been recapture districts, and thanks to the tax reforms that we've passed, HISD for the first time in a while has come off of that recapture list. And SBISD, I think, reduced its recapture by about 90%. We're hoping to get off of recapture pretty soon. I know that doesn't affect really funding for the schools, but for the taxpayers, it's a good thing.
Right.
Taxpayers should be paying taxes. That's the plan for the districts in which the taxes are paid. That said, those school districts that offer LOHI, as they come off of recapture, what is that financial detriment, I say, to the school district, not the taxpayer, but to the school district? If you could describe that, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, this is a very significant conundrum that y'all are going to have to think through. You heard me mention, as sort of as a kind of an oh, by the way, if you are in a district that has LOHI, you've given your taxpayers a tax break, which is great, good conservative budgeting practice. If you are any other taxing jurisdiction, like a city or a county, and you do that, you just reduce your budget and deal with it. In public education, it's split. If you're a non-recapture district, you reduce your budget and deal with it. If you're a recapture district, we cut your recapture bill, and it's sort of like a funding source for the LOHI that you have given to your taxpayers. What this means, though, is that as rate compression continues to happen, as tax rates go down, if you fall out of recapture, you will no longer have that funding source to fund your LOHI, which means your budget will actually get cut. And so it is largely true that as tax rates come down, it doesn't affect a district budget, except in this one circumstance. And it does affect district budgets, and it can be substantive. So the dollar value that affects district budget is going to vary in every district, and we'd have to model that for you. But I mean, a district the size of Spring Branch is several $1 million. And so once they stop paying recapture, their budget will be reduced by several $1 million, unless either they end their LOHI, in which case they're in the unenviable situation of increasing tax rates. And by the way, you won't let them do that. It's LOHI is a one-way street in state law right now. Or you have to change the finance formulas to do something about this. And what you did in Senate Bill 2 is you added a hold harmless just for Senate Bill 2. But that's not a general hold harmless every time this thing happens. So you could take the posture that you're going to strap a new hold harmless on the, pardon the vernacular, you're going to put a new hold harmless on the system like every year, and the insane complexity of the school finance system will only increase, or you need to come up with some other sort of policy solution to this LOHI thing. And there are a variety of them, and they're all complex, but you could just choose to give everybody LOHI and fund it statewide. If you do that, I think it's like $2 billion per year forever. And so you could ease into it over time to reduce this problem, but this problem was only going to get more and more acute as you continue to deliver more and more property tax compression to your property taxpayers.
Well, thank you for that. I thought it was as complicated as you just described. It is.
You're welcome.
And if I'm going to be knocking on your door pretty soon to talk that through a little more.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Members, at this point, although I love having Commissioner Morath as a permanent resource witness for the committee, I think everybody that has asked has had an opportunity to visit with him. There are a few of you that wanted to have like a follow-up second bite of the apple, and I would encourage you to visit with him. The TA and the commissioner have been a great resource, for me and for my districts. But otherwise, we still have a few more witnesses. We appreciate you starting with us at 8 a.m. and
Yes, sir.
sticking through most of the day with us.
2 o'clock, all right, excellent.
You've been a trooper. But I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move on with our next presentation.
Thank you, members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we'll hear from the Legislative Budget Board staff on the interaction of the Foundation School Program and property tax relief. The chair calls Avery Sachs, Maggie Jepson, and Aaron Hendrickson.